In this video, we will discuss vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere Distributed Switch. vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere Distributed Switch enables Tanzu Kubernetes Grid servers for vSphere using existing vSphere 7 compute, storage, and networking. During this lesson, we will describe vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere Distributed Switch, describe workload load balancers, describe workload networks, identify vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere Distributed Switch network requirements, describe vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere the Distributed Switch network topology, and enable vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere Distributed Switch. vSphere with Tanzu transforms vSphere into a native Kubernetes platform. A cluster that is enabled with vSphere with Tanzu is called a supervisor cluster. The supervisor cluster runs on top of an SDDC layer that includes the following elements: ESXi for compute, vSphere distributed switch for networking, vSAN or any other shared storage solution as the shared storage for the control plane VMs and Tanzu Kubernetes Grid VMs. After a supervisor cluster is created, you create namespaces in the supervisor cluster that are called supervisor namespaces. DevOps engineers can create upstream Kubernetes clusters by using the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid service. In vSphere 7 Update 1, each ESXi host is licensed with a vSphere Enterprise Plus license, and the cluster object is licensed separately with an add-on Kubernetes license. This enables the feature sets for vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere Distributed Switch. vSphere with Tanzu on Distributed Switch supports existing vSphere compute, storage, and networking. It does not require NSX-T data center-based networking, instead uses the built-in vSphere Distributed Switch. A vSphere Distributed Switch does not have native load balancer capabilities. Therefore, an external load balancer is the only additional component that is required for enabling vSphere with Tanzu on Distributed Switch. vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere Distributed Switch is composed of the WCP service running on the vCenter server appliance and 3 supervisor control plane VMs that run various system pods. vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere Distributed Switch does not support vSphere pods. Therefore, Spherelet is not a component of vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere Distributed Switch. The WCP service runs within the vCenter server appliance. It provisions and manages the supervisor control plane VMs. It also creates vSphere namespaces and performs lifecycle management of the supervisor cluster. Within the supervisor control plane VMs, we have a Tanzu Kubernetes Grid controller. This performs Tanzu Kubernetes clusters lifecycle configuration management. It also translates Tanzu Kubernetes cluster specification types into cluster and machine constructs that CAPI and CAPW can understand. CAPI and CAPW performs Tanzu Kubernetes cluster lifecycle management and dynamically selects a network for VMs based on the networks assigned to the vSphere namespace. The VM operator manages the VM lifecycle on the ESXi hosts and requests a network interface for VMs on the network selected by CAPW. The net operator and the LB API operator are new additions in vSphere 7 Update 1. The net operator facilitates a declarative Kubernetes API to create provider-agnostic networks and network interfaces. It watches for services of type load balancer being created for the supervisor cluster and Tanzu Kubernetes clusters, and translates these services into provider-agnostic load balancer virtual server configurations. The LB API operator is a provider-specific operator for HA proxy. It manages load balancer virtual server configurations. It acts on resources created by the net operator and creates HA proxy virtual server configurations. It communicates with the HA proxy control plane. A workload load balancer is a vSphere with Tanzu representation of an external load balancer that is used by supervisor clusters and Tanzu Kubernetes clusters. HA proxy is currently the only external load balancer supported at initial release. Support for additional load balancers is planned for future updates. The HA proxy control plane API endpoint, credentials, and virtual server IP range are stored in the supervisor cluster control plane VMs. The virtual server IP range is reserved by HA proxy load balancer. A workload network is a network construct that is used by supervisor control plane VMs and vSphere namespaces. The workload network is supported by a vSphere distributed switch port group. An IP range is defined to allocate an IP address for VMs attached to the workload network. A primary workload network must be selected. By default, if you have one workload network, that will always be the primary. The supervisor control plane VMs attach to the primary workload network's port group. Workload networks have different characteristics depending on the component of vSphere with Tanzu that consumes them. In a supervisor cluster, you can have multiple workload networks. When using more than one workload network, a primary workload network must be selected. Control plane VMs are assigned an IP address from the primary workload network. In vSphere namespaces, you can assign a workload network during namespace creation. Only one workload network can be assigned to a vSphere namespace. Tanzu Kubernetes clusters deployed in the vSphere namespace are assigned IP addresses from the workload network address range. In this example of a vSphere with Tanzu on distributed switch network topology, the vCenter server and HA proxy load balancer reside in a management ESXi cluster, and a separate ESXi cluster is used for workloads. Both ESXi clusters are attached to a single vSphere distributed switch consisting of several port groups. A management port group, vCenter server, HA proxy load balancer, and supervisor control plane VMs each have an interface on this port group. A front-end port group. This is a separate port group used for ingress traffic to the supervisor cluster and workloads. HA proxy is attached to this port group. Load balancer virtual server IPs are issued on this network. And we have multiple workload port groups. Multiple workload port groups can be used for workload networks. One workload network must be designated as the primary workload network. The supervisor control plane VMs and HA proxy will each have an interface attached to the primary workload network port group. vSphere namespaces are assigned workload networks, and Tanzu Kubernetes grid clusters that are deployed to vSphere namespaces attach to the assigned workload network port group. Workload networks must meet the following requirements. Workload networks must be routable to the primary workload network. Workload networks must be routable to the HA proxy front-end network. vCenter server, the supervisor control plane, and HA proxy management interfaces must also be routable. And no address overlap between workload networks should exist. The HA proxy load balancer must meet the following requirements. The virtual server IP range must be dedicated to HA proxy, and the virtual server IP range must not overlap with any workload network address range. Before you can enable vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere distributed switch, the following prerequisites must be met. vSphere DRS and vSphere HA must be enabled on the ESXi cluster. A distributed virtual switch version 7 is required, and the load balancer HA proxy must be configured. And lastly, a Tanzu Kubernetes grid service content library must be created. Current and new versions of Tanzu Kubernetes clusters are provided by a subscribed content library managed by VMware. As new versions are released, VMware updates the subscribed content library with new versions of Tanzu Kubernetes clusters. To enable vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere distributed switch, navigate to Menu and Workload Management in the vSphere client to get started. Click the Getting Started button. Select vCenter Server Network to enable vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere distributed switch. Select the cluster you wish to enable vSphere with Tanzu. The cluster must have HA and DRS enabled. Select the size for the supervisor cluster control plane VMs. Select a storage policy to determine where the supervisor control plane VMs reside. Provide a DNS name for your load balancer. Select the type of load balancer. HA proxy is the only load balancer supported on initial release. Provide the HA proxy data plane API address. Provide a username and password to allow the supervisor cluster control plane to communicate with the HA proxy load balancer. This username and password is defined on the HA proxy load balancer. Provide an IP address range to serve the virtual servers from the HA proxy load balancer. and provide the server certificate for the HA proxy load balancer. Configure the management network for the control plane VMs. Configure a workload network. We must create at least one workload network for the environment. A workload network is mapped to a distributed switch port group. Provide the gateway, subnet, and IP range used by the workload network. Choose the content library previously created to host Tanzu Kubernetes Grid versions. Review all the details before confirming and click Finish. vSphere with Tanzu will be configured on the ESXi cluster. Supervisor control plane VMs will be deployed to the cluster. This process will take several minutes. Once complete, you are ready to consume vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere Distributed Switch. That concludes this demo video. At the end of this lesson, we've described vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere Distributed Switch, described workload load balancers, described workload networks, identified the requirements for vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere Distributed Switch, described the network topology of vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere Distributed Switch, and enabled vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere Distributed Switch. The key points: vSphere with Tanzu on vSphere Distributed Switch enables Tanzu Kubernetes Grid service for vSphere 7 using existing vSphere 7 compute, storage, and networking capabilities. vSphere with Tanzu for vSphere Distributed Switch does not support vSphere pods. Workload load balancers provide load balancing capabilities to Tanzu Kubernetes Grid clusters. Workload networks provide IP ranges to Tanzu Kubernetes Grid clusters. Thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed this video.